So, James Harper, thanks very much for joining me once again on Hermitix podcast. We are going to be discussing the life and work of Jiddu Krishnamurti, who, in a sentence, was a spiritual speaker. I could say teacher, though he would, I think, times push against what is being taught, the idea of a teaching we'll get to very quickly, I think. But he was a spiritual speaker, a writer, and I think of his writings, most popular was Freedom from the Known, and then The First and Last Freedom. And then in preparation for this, I know we've both spent a lot of time with his commentaries on the living. And there is, it's an understatement to say there is a lot more, both writing and talks. So, and also a fascinating biography as well. So, James, what is your history with Krishnamurti? And I guess just that. I mean, I guess you've spent so much. I understand you've spent so many years sort of with him now.
I have, James, and thank you very much for inviting me again on your podcast. It's a great pleasure to be on it. I came across him in 1983, and it was after a spiritual experience I had the previous year, which we talked about in your previous podcast, where I had this very profound meditational experience where I sort of felt as if I'd shifted consciousness, and I wanted to underpin it with a spiritual structure of some sort. I threw myself into Christianity, and I really went for it. Went to all the churches I could go to, did the prayers on my knees, listened to the sermons, did everything. And after a while, I had to admit that despite my affection with Anglicanism, and a lot of my ancestors were Church of Ireland ministers, that it wasn't giving me what I wanted. And then fatefully, I moved into a flat in Hammersmith in London, and with two flatmates whom I didn't know. And one of them, called Susie, had a discussion with me about the nature of love. And it went on for hours and hours. And next day, she left out a book called The First Penguin Krishnamurti Reader. And she'd earmarked a chapter on love. And so I thought, okay, I'd never heard of Krishnamurti. So I read it, and it was like a revelation, really. He articulated almost every single thought that I had but couldn't express. And so I read the rest of the book in a flush of excitement, and I thought, this is it. This is someone who is speaking directly to me in a spiritual way, but also in a practical way. And what I particularly liked about this book was that he addressed everyday problems that I have, and everyone has, like loneliness, anxiety, fear. What is pleasure? What is God? Why do we dream? What is the nature of love? What is the nature of the self? And so on. And as I say, I didn't know who he was. I didn't know whether he was alive or dead or what. And his name made me think he must be yet another Indian guru, of which there were quite a few at that time, including the Bhagwan Maharishi. And but I did a bit of exploring and found out that he was alive. He was quite old. He was about 87, I think. No, yes, about 87 then. And he gave talks at Brockwood Park in Hampshire, which is a Krishnamurti school. And he was giving annual talks there. So I rushed down, thinking, my luck if he dies before I get there. So I sped down the M3, got to Brockwood Park. I was late for the talk. There was a huge marquee, and the entrance was closed. So I sort of crawled underneath the awning and sat on the grass and saw him sitting on a hardback chair on stage with a microphone, and there was dead silence, about 1,000 people. And he spoke for an hour without any notes, and I can't remember what he spoke on, but he was very, very magnetic. And then afterwards, there was no clapping. He just walked out. And I was getting cramps in my legs, so I was squatting on the grass. So I rolled over and climbed out underneath the awning and stood up, and there he was looking at me. So I gave him a wave, didn't know what to do, and he waved back and walked into the nearby rose garden. So that was the closest I got to him. But from then on, I just read his books, and I went to a talk the following year. And then he died in 1986. I'll say a few words about his life, which is extraordinary. But there is a retreat center at Brockwood Park, which I go to regularly. And so that was the start of my journey, James, with Krishnamurti. And I have to say that I can't think of anyone else or any body of work that has influenced me more in my daily life than his writings, because they're so practical, and yet they extend into big existential issues as well, like, is there a God? And if so, what do we do about it? And if you like, I could say, give you a quick rundown on his life, which is one of the weirdest lives I'd come across, unless you'd like to.
Well, the only thing I'd add is just the typical question when it comes to being physically close to a guru. Was there any resonance or felt, just that silence? It sounds like was the.
Yes, I think it was I mean, he never called himself a guru. In fact, he rejected, as you know, all forms of authority and spiritual authority. He'd hate to be called a guru, but nevertheless, you can't help but build up an image in your mind. If you've been reading someone avidly, even if it's a popular novelist and you see them in a restaurant, you get a little frisson. So, yeah, I stood up and I saw God. And what do you do when you see God? You wave, I suppose, and he waved back, and that was it. So it was both banal and yet extremely moving for me, because I think it was part of the journey was rushing down the M3 and knowing I was late. And the year before that, I didn't know if he was alive at all. I didn't know who he was. So I guess I had built him up in my mind. Yeah.
I don't think one can help building not just someone up in their mind, but even I mean, just as an example, I remember attending my first Gurdjieff meeting with sort of almost trembling with, and really it was just people sat in a room, but as you say, you build something up. But yes, let's talk about his life, which, as you say, is it's strange. It's also a certain point in time. I mean, reading history books now, as you will know, as someone interested in spirituality, I still find it so fascinating to hear mention of theosophy, because every time you read of theosophy, in its day, it was the thing. It was the biggest, most popular, almost sort of one of the originary alternative spiritualities, and yet now, and we'll sort of find out why now it's not really much at all, other than a big footnote, we could say. But yes, please, I guess, introduce the biography of Kay.
Try and, at a decent pace, because it's hugely interesting. And there is a biography by Mary Latchins into actually 3 parts now, which you can read. But basically, he was born in 1895 into a Brahmin family, one of 8 children. And his mum died when he was 10. And when he was 14, he had a chance encounter. Schmance. It seemed to be a destined thing, which changed his life. He was walking on a beach with his brother Nitya and a couple of friends. He'd just been at school, where he was caned almost every day for being a dreamy pupil. When he turned around and saw this huge, great white man with a huge white beard, like described it as Santa Claus in mufti, staring at him. And the white man came towards him. Krishnamurti assumed he was English, as he was, and said to Krishnamurti, "I've just seen your aura. It's the most pure aura I've ever seen. I think you're going to be the Maitreya, the world teacher, i.e. the Messiah, which we Theosophists are expecting. He comes around every 2,000 years, and I think you're the one." So you can imagine this 14-year-old Indian schoolboy who's just been caned, probably been told he was very stupid. Suddenly he's been told he's the Messiah. It's like the life of Brian, really. So they go back to his house, and the white man, he's called Charles Ledbetter, and he's one of two leaders of the Theosophical Society, along with a woman called Annie Besant, who was a wonderful socialist, proto-feminist reformer, and so on. And Charles Ledbetter says to the father of Krishnamurti, "Look, I've just seen your son's aura. I think he's the one. I think he's the Maitreya, the world teacher. And I think it's best if we Theosophists take him to England, educate him, feed him, clothe him, and initiate him into the Theosophical hierarchy. What do you say to that?" And of course, Krishnamurti's father is a bit nonplussed. But I mean, I am giving a synopsis. The father probably thought, "Oh, well, he'll get a better deal in England with the Theosophists than he will here in Adyar, who's near Madras, known as Chennai now." And he said, "Yes, okay." And he said, "There's one condition: you have to take his brother too, Nitya, because they're devoted to each other." So Ledbetter said, "Fine, let's do this thing." So he telegrammed Annie Besant saying something like, "We've got him!" exclamation mark. Sorry, that's my interpretation, but that's basically what he said. And Annie Besant was thrilled. Said, "Bring it on." So in 1911, Krishnamurti and his brother Nitya went to England for the first time. And there was a huge interest in this. As you say, Theosophy was big business in those days. And I don't mean that in a cynical way. I was going to delay talking about Theosophy till later, but I'll say it now. It was basically a group that, an esoteric group that took bits of spirituality from different religions, i.e. Hinduism, Buddhism, and Christianity. And it was predicated on the fact that the human soul evolved through different incarnations. And that those Theosophists alive were guided by invisible masters. And the invisible masters were both flesh and blood, but you never saw them because they were tucked away in places like the Himalayas. But you could also communicate with them on the astral plane. And two of them in particular would communicate with Ledbetter and Annie Besant, mostly Ledbetter, who was very psychic. And of course, so there was a sort of a structural flaw in Theosophy from the start, in as much as the leadership were privy to the wisdom of the invisible masters, and no one could contradict them. Whatever Ledbetter said basically went, because you couldn't say, "Well, I don't think that's a very good idea," because Ledbetter would say, "Well, it's tough because the invisible masters say that it should be this way." There was also a very arcane system of hierarchy where you went through various initiatory levels until the highest. And Krishnamurti was kind of fast-tracked into almost the highest level straight away. And he, true to their words, they educated him. He had very good tutors. He learned Sanskrit, Latin, and Greek. He was put down for Oxford, and his brother Nitya was the same. And during the First World War, the Theosophists were worried he might get hurt, so they were siphoned off to Cornwall. Krishnamurti actually volunteered to work in a hospital in Dunkirk, and Annie Besant said, no, we've waited 2,000 years for the Maitreya. We're not going to risk you getting a stray German shell. So you stay put in Cornwall, where he was extremely bored and frustrated. He seemed to have bought into the whole theosophical way of life quite wholeheartedly. Everyone says he was a very kind, selfless, dreamy lad. He wasn't academic or scholarly at all. He failed to get into Oxford in 1918, I think it was. He tried. Failed to get into London University. He wasn't cut out for scholarship. In about 1921, there is a turning point, the first of several big turning points, when Nitya, his beloved brother, coughs up blood. And it's clear he has tuberculosis. And the Theosophists are very good. They, give Nitya the best treatment available at the time, but that is very erratic. In 1922, they are in America because there are theosophical outposts all over Europe and also in Australia and in America, in California, Ojai Valley. And in 1922, he starts what's called the process. I don't know if you've come across this, James, this bit of his biography, but what happened was he had a series of terrible pains in the neck and the head, which would go on for days. Mm. But Nitya said that one occasion it went on for 70 days, where he was kind of rolling around in agony, and no one quite knew what was wrong with him. And when he did this, he would lose consciousness or partially lose consciousness, and another voice would speak, referring to Krishnamurti in the third person. And this new strange voice often had the persona of a child. And the child voice would say something like, he is in another place at the moment, but he wants the room to be very clean. He wants you to stay with him while he's in this condition. So the voice would sort of give instructions to those who were in the room next to the body of Krishnamurti. Eventually he would emerge and his consciousness would be changed. He would have a fantastic sort of clarity of literal vision, but also spiritual vision. Now, after this happened on one occasion at Ojai in California, he was encouraged to sit underneath a pepper tree, and witnesses who were Nitya, a woman called Rosalind Williams, a young American woman, and a man whose name I can't remember, beginning with W, witnessed what seemed to be what Siddhartha Gautama went through when he became Buddha, i.e. as they felt a tremendous sense of energy and light emanating from Krishnamurti. And he seemed to be chanting to himself. But they were filled with awe. Nitya and Rosalind, Nitya remembers looking at Rosalind's face, and it sort of reminds me of the ending of, this is a spoiler warning, the film Close Encounters of the Third Kind. I don't know if you've seen that, James, but
not for a long time.
Heck, I'm going to do the spoiler. Spaceship comes down, and their faces, the witnesses, are just agog. And Rosalind's face was her eyes were open, and she was hypnotized. And she kept saying, "Can you see him coming? Can you see him coming?" As if she was seeing an apparition of the Lord Buddha or some invisible spiritual being, or visible to her. Anyway, it left a huge mark on the three witnesses, all of whom wrote about it afterwards. And Krishnamurti wrote about it afterwards. And he said he remembered leaving his body and sort of finding sort of union with the Great Spirit. So that was 1922. After that, he began to get even more serious doubts about theosophy. He was wary about the hierarchy, the role of the invisible masters, the power that certain individuals wielded, but he was still locked into it, largely through his personal relationship with Annie Besant, to whom he was the son. I think she never had. I don't think she had a son. Certainly, he treated her as the mother he had lost. He would refer to her in letters as dear mummy or dear mother or dear Amma. And he knew that it would break her heart if he suddenly turned his back on theosophy. In 1929, the big moment happened when he could no longer bear to live under what he thought was a falsehood. And at this theosophical camp in Holland, a place called Ommen, he dissolved the Order of the Star of the East, which was the theosophical sect which had been formed to launch him as the new Messiah, the Maitreya. And he stood up and he said, I'm resigning. I maintain that truth is a pathless land, and you cannot approach it by any religion, by any sect. It's a wonderful speech. I think it's one of the greatest speeches of the 20th century. It sort of covers everything, and it sort of formulates the essence of his teaching. And that was it, really. The rest of his life, from 1930 to 1986, that's 56 years, he did the same thing every year, which was to give talks in 6 to 8 countries, mostly England, America, Australia, India, France, Switzerland, Holland, and many other countries too. More or less saying the same thing in slightly different ways. And he wrote very few books, but a lot of his talks were recorded or written down, and they became the basis for his, as you very sensitively said, not teachings, but speakings or offerings, verbal offerings, should we say, because he hated the word teacher because it implied that he had knowledge that he was going to impart to someone who didn't have knowledge. And again, he insisted he didn't want followers. He wasn't forming a religion. He described himself as like a wildflower on the roadside. And if you happened to be passing and you wanted to sniff the perfume, you're very, very welcome. And if not, that was absolutely fine by him. But he didn't want you to linger, pick the flower, or try and find other flowers. So that was basically his life. And it was so, sort of ironic that Charles Ledbetter, who thought he'd found the theosophical Maitreya, the world teacher, actually did find the world teacher in a way, but not in the way that he thought. And it did break Annie Besant's heart.
Literally.
Yeah.
And when she got the telegram or call, she had was it a stroke?
I think soon after that,
Yeah.
she, 1933, and he was, Krishnamurti was he was very, upset himself. He wanted to, they loved each other. It's clear from their letters. They were devoted. And right in the last year of her life, she got dementia and could hardly recognize him. And he'd just sit with her and hold her hand. And, it was very, very moving and touching. But a lot of people were heartbroken because they had invested so much in him. And
I guess, just to contextualize that, I guess if you are, and one can never really say to what degree anyone is a true believer of anything, if it's not my experience, but if you were a true believer of theosophy, then this is you are literally seeing the equivalent of the promised prophet deny their role. That's quite so it's in that sense it's a strange one, and not it isn't the case that the prophecy hasn't come true. It's something even more almost harrowing than that, because you're seeing the prophecy or whatever it might be break. and be denied, which is not the nicest thing to see. And when I've spoken to John Michael Greer, the spiritual writer, about this, he sort of says that is the moment, if we had to pin one, that theosophy, it kind of becomes what it is now, which isn't anything even remotely close to what it was then. But I think, you also have Rudolf Steiner, who, at one point was firmly in theosophy and then also goes off and does his own thing. So
Yeah.
it seems to be a good teaching ground for these people, but it went too far with them, I guess.
I think so. And I think theosophy gets a bad rap from, generally speaking. You can see why it does. But on the other hand, I want to stress that it fulfilled a need for a lot of people and gave particularly women a way of expressing their spirituality that the mainstream religions didn't. Buddhism, Islam, Christianity. I mean, the idea that Annie Besant should be kind of like at the top of the tree of a spiritual movement would have been unheard of it's taken us this long to get a female Archbishop of Canterbury. So it gave an outlet for a lot of women who had spiritual instincts and couldn't express them. That was the first thing. Also, we tried to find the best in other religions. Say, look, this is very good in Buddhism. This is good in Christianity. There should be a huge brotherhood and sisterhood of religions and not fight each other. So I think it had very, very good instincts. And I just want to stress that to any.
I don't want to be. Yeah, I'm sorry if I sound too cruel about theosophy.
No, because I think that's the standard, and I share that because it had this terrible inbuilt flaw, I think, of the invisible masters, which was open to abuse, and indeed that's proved to be the case, really. Which, you can read about it in Mary Lutchens's books, but there was a lot of politicking amongst, yeah.
So
then what? 1930, he was no longer the Messiah. He was giving back property that had been sort of funded in the name of theosophy. So what was he going to do? So all the while he'd been formulating his own teaching, which emerged, and luckily for him and for me and for us, he was supported by people who gave donations and enabled him to fly to different places and to give his talks, and these are contained in numerous books. I think they're about.
Do you know? Did he ever, after maybe some time had passed, speak about the reality of the Maitreya, of that thing that he was supposed to be of? Did he ever? So obviously he disembodies the Order of the Star and he moves on from theosophy, but does he ever speak about, was there any truth to that idea?
Not extensively, as far as I can tell from Mary Lutchens, who's the biggest source, but he did say that the spiritual impulse he had did manifest itself in him actually seeing the spiritual masters of theosophy. He saw visual images of, but then he said he also, when he was sort of interested in Buddhism, which he was, saw the Buddha. The Buddha manifested himself to Krishnamurti in Sicily. So he gave the impression that his spiritual imagination was so intense and powerful that he could sort of see manifestations of the spiritual climate he was in. But I think he, in terms of the politics of theosophy, I think he was quite clear in saying that he thought it was, one of his words is nonsense, a word he uses quite a lot. And I think, he was dismissive of the politics. And I didn't dwell on the details, but it does get very, very silly at one stage, where there are two theosophists called Wedgwood and Arundel, and they started sort of getting messages from the invisible masters, and Wedgwood, it was either Wedgwood or Arundel saying, oh, initiates have to wear silk pajamas and they have to do this and that, and there has to be a number of apostles to serve the Maitreya. And it was getting, and Krishnamurti was very cross at this when he was told about it. This is roughly in 1927, 26. And I think it was that sort of behavior of sort of ritualism getting out of hand that made him accelerated his decision to say, look, this is not for me, you know.
It's intriguing, and I mean, I'll say the heretical similarity, but it's almost as if Jesus got to see what Paul did with the teachings, right? And say, well, hang on a minute, what are you doing there? Anyway, so that's Krishnamurti's life in short, in very short, and so that leads us to the sort of unfortunate but fortunate, paradoxical problem of now trying to find a path in the pathless land of talking about why we're talking about him at all, which is the, in quotation marks, teachings, because he wrote and he spoke and wrote things that you would read that have very practical, as you've already mentioned, actionable effects on one's life. That you read these and you read what he's written, you listen to his talks, you understand that he is talking about how to live a better, more peaceful, more spiritual life. But even saying it in those terms makes one, it seems as if, you know, there's no longer a spiritual grammar there. That was one of the first things I remember when I read Krishnamurti, that really wasn't, you know, in Theosophy, as you said, you'd have the old masters, and in Buddhism, you'd have the grammar, and Christianity, you'd have angels and archangels, and virtues. With Krishnamurti, there really wasn't any of this. And so it was very, very plain. The almost funny side of it is, as you've mentioned, and as other people mentioned, that Krishnamurti said the same thing basically in everything he wrote and said for the next however many years of his life, but not once does it feel repetitive. No. And it's kind of miraculous that he manages to do that. So I know that there's many angles that we could try come at this pathless land. First thing is to emphasize it's not a teaching. There is no authority, and he would probably he definitely would dislike us saying it's teaching, so we're going to be talking about it, I guess. But we'll dive right into the center of, I guess, the ego. The ego is if there is ironically, there isn't a center. That's one of the big problems. But we'll begin with the center, which is what's the ego for Krishnamurti, or if you want to add anything on about sort of that meta, what this even is, before we go forward.
Well, as you say, yes, Krishnamurti hated interpretations of his work. And so that's my disclaimer, that I'm going to try not to interpret, but simply present, because he didn't mind people talking about. He encouraged what he called dialogue, with a capital D. And if you go to the retreat center, they have a regular thing where you watch a video of Krishnamurti and then have a dialogue discussing what he's talked about. So I think what we're doing is valid. We're having a dialogue, but we're not interpreting as such, I hope. We're sort of grappling. And as you say, the ego, the self, is at the center of his teachings, because in the commentaries on living, which is this fellow here, there are 88 chapters dealing with all sorts of topics. At random, I'm reading authority, meditation, anger, psychological security, separateness, power, serenity, fulfillment, words, idea and fact, continuity, self-defense, lowliness, and so on. 88. And so we can't talk about 88 things, but for me, the central issue that these things lead to is the concepts of the self, the ego, the me, the I, the sort of interchangeable terms that Krishnamurti uses, more or less. And it seems to how he presents it is this, that if, for example, I mean, it's very simple in a way that, we're born with an ego, with a self that makes me James Harpur and you James Ellis. Mm-hmm. And we forge ourselves, our egos. We carve out an identity, and we identify ourselves with our jobs and so on. And because the ego tends to be quite insecure, we often identify ourselves with something greater than ourselves, a tribe, like a family or football team. In my case, West Ham United, sadly. What's tribe I could have picked. With our country, with our school, with our university, anything that kind of magnifies ourselves and makes us feel special. So if West Ham win, it kind of, I feel I've won, and vice versa, and so on. So Krishnamurti, I suppose, asks the question, what happens if there isn't an I, a self? What would happen? What would happen to your feeling of being lonely, which is something I feel quite a lot. This is a fictional example, but if, for example, 3 or 4 of your friends are invited to a party and you're not, you naturally feel left out and alienated and lonely. But who is it who feels that? What is the thing in you that feels lonely? Or the thing in you that feels cross if your book has a bad review? Or the thing in you that feels pleased if your book has a good review? There's a thing in you that reacts, that's reactive to circumstance. And most of us, for all of our lives, seesaw between pleasure and pain. We seek pleasure, but we get pain, and the thing inside us that will react accordingly. So the question that Krishnamurti asks again and again is that if you want to go along that path, that's absolutely fine by him. But if you get fed up, if the pain and the loneliness and the anxiety and the fear outweighs the possessiveness, the pleasures, the feeling of security that you get temporarily from your football team going on a good run. If you get fed up with that, what are you going to do about it? How are you going to eliminate, not his word, my word, eliminate the self, come to terms with the self, get rid of the self, evaporate the self? What do you do? How do you do it? And he asks this again and again in different ways, usually in the guise of chapters about loneliness or anxiety or fear. And there we get to the sort of the crux. How does the self cope or get rid of or neutralize the self? And that's where everyone comes unstuck, because you reach a paradox where it's like an eye surgeon doing an operation on himself or herself. And because, well, in fact, eye surgeon is quite an apt metaphor for a me surgeon. You can't do it because every effort you make strengthens the thing you're trying to get rid of. Along the same lines that he points out that if you say, I must be humble, the very effort to be humble mobilizes the I, which moves against being humble, even though you think you might be. So everything you do, like I must diet, I must not be angry, even positive actions involving the ego, the self, the me, the I, will strengthen the me, the self, the I, and will be counterproductive. That's what he suggests to us. So then what you do, you no effort will be able to neutralize or come to terms with the I, the self, the me, the ego. So what he suggests is, and this is a sort of, terrible summary or précis, is that you do nothing, which is something I think you suggested to me in one of your emails.
Yeah.
Do nothing, but it's not exactly nothing. He talks about a state of being which he calls passive awareness or passive alertness, which is to say that you are super aware. You're not dopey, sleepy, lazy, slothful, sitting in an armchair with your slippers on and sort of gazing at the fire. You are super aware. You're listening. You're looking. You're being appreciative of everything around you, and yet you're not engaging with it, which is where the passive bit comes in. So that you become a sort of a super aware witness, like a member, or as if you're watching a Shakespeare play and you're absolutely on the edge of your seat, listening to every word, watching every action. And because you're so involved in it, you're not engaging in a analytical way. The brain's not saying, "Oh gosh, I wonder what's going to happen next. Oh wow, look at that." You're just there's no separation between the observer and the observed, which is one of his phrases. The observer, and you can do. He says by meditation and by passive alertness, this is possible. Now, I'm not sure I've ever been able to do this, but that, in essence, I think that conundrum, that issue, is at the heart of his teaching.
Well, the idea of doing it is brought back into the paradox of the self, and that, I think, the reason at the time I said to do nothing, not that I'm do nothing all the time, but it was thinking back to quitting cigarettes, quitting smoking, and on the one hand you could just smoke, in which case you're smoking a cigarette, and on the other hand, when I tried to quit, I still knew I wasn't smoking a cigarette, which is a horrible void of, yes, I'm absolutely not smoking right now, right? This feeling of not, because so both of those things at the time there was a duality, which I'm sure we'll get to, but it was a duality which was fueling the same fire. So at that horrible point, and I think that's sort of a micro example of belief in God, which is those who believe in God and those who don't believe in God both believe in God, which is something to untangle. If people want to, we might get to that. But both are pouring fuel on the same fire, and doing nothing it's a complete paradox, because you have to let it burn out. There's nothing you can do to let it burn out. But I also wouldn't go so far as giving up comes close, submission comes close. But I mean, to draw in the UG Krishnamurti, who he has this idea that I think is there for J Krishnamurti as well, which is you're backed into the self is backed into a corner with no escape. The horrible point of, you now know that you can't do anything. So the self's self-knowledge that it is the cause of all ill, that thought and I is the cause of all ill and suffering, but then also the knowledge that now, from this point on, I also know that I know. And that's the corner that you have to be backed into. And I don't know what you can speak of beyond that point. I mean, awareness, right? Awareness is the classic the classic one. I guess you can do sort of small exercises relating to what you said there, which is probably the most famous Krishnamurti line, which is "The thinker is the thought." Um, I like to rephrase it as "The believer is the belief." Seems to give it some more robustness, and just the question of, okay, well, all right, take away the belief now, kick out the supports. Now what? There's still something, and that's the key point, right? Is you're not going to die. Well, you might die, but not. I'm jumbling everything up. You have to die. There you go. Doing nothing is dying in a way.
I think it's a very interesting point, that, because I think Krishnamurti, towards the end of his life, in a moment with, I think it was Mary Lutchins, or there was another Mary called Mary Zimbalist. There were about 3 Marys who he knew. And Krishnamurti said to one of them that, I think I'm not sure he was lamenting, but he was just curious that he'd been speaking for 56 years, more or less, and not one person had changed radically in the way that he was suggesting one can. He talks about a radical inner revolution where you see the world in a different way instantly. He was not against, but he was skeptical of gradual revolution. And it's my feeling is that if you eliminate your ego, or that, to use your word, that it does feel like dying, and it feels like proper dying. It's not just sort of kicking a habit. It feels as if you're actually going to jump off a cliff physically, because you're dying to everything you hold dear. You're dying to, well, this is the fear, that you're going to die to everything you love, your parents, your children, your possessions, everything, the laughter, the friendships. That's the feeling. Like proper dying, really. And I think in the last instant, no one can quite face that, or that possibility. And you get quite far. You can see the sense of it. You can see, I really don't want to be lonely. I don't want to be angry. I don't want to be jealous anymore. I really want to, get as far as coping with those things, but I don't want to die to myself. And so you keep going on the way you are, putting up with the bad things and enjoying the better things, but not changing radically in the way that he suggested we can.
And I think with that, in the same way that you might know this experience as a writer, or I know, anything you create, you will spend years possibly creating something, and people will always mention something you didn't expect, and that same, or you will always be remembered for. You'll give something you created over to someone, they'll say, "I really like that bit." You think, "Oh, I didn't even bother with it. I didn't even think about that." And the reason I mention this is this exact same experience in terms of giving up one's riches, to use other spiritual language. I think if you can consciously think about the riches that you might have to give up to die to, I think many people on the spiritual pathless path can think about, that's what I think I could give up all my possessions. I think I could give up my relationships, or whatever it might be, or my car, or my job. But the problem is, as you talk about there with dying, is when you get nearer the end, which isn't really an end, if you can think about the things consciously, they're probably not the things. There's always something, or maybe a couple of things, or a few things that you think, "Oh, I didn't realize I'd have to give up that," and that whatever that is the terrifying thing that makes you run. And usually you just did not even see it, and and that there is for everyone. I think if you can consciously think about it, then probably ain't the thing that you're actually terrified of.
Would have just scared this.
Well, no, but I think the thing might even be silly, or you didn't even realize. I mean, I think recently I read by Alexander Thoreau. He wrote a brilliant essay about his time as a Trappist, and he only went for 6 months to a year, and he said that the biggest realization, the thing that made him actually escape during the night, was because he missed being around and talking to women. Very simple. And there's so many things in that fear that you just aren't ever going to think about the possibility that might be the thing that goes. All of a sudden, you just don't get to have that relation with the world anymore. That is terrifying.
Terrifying, yeah. You're on the verge and suddenly think, toast and marmalade.
Literally, yeah.
You're right. No, that's right. And also, yeah, along the same lines, I would miss writing. Well, in my case, poetry, mostly poetry. And we touched upon this subject, that I feel that Krishnamurti kind of threatens me, or rather, his words threaten my sense of creativity, my along the basis. I think it's when I came across a passage in one of his books where he says something along these lines, that when you encounter a tree or something like a tree, to have a proper relationship with a tree or anything else, you have to observe it without interference. That if you bring in your conditioning and what he calls naming, that you're sort of bringing in a filter, which impedes a direct relationship with the tree in this particular example. And he says that he kind of implies that that direct relationship is incredibly rich and special, that there's no filter, it's just you and the tree. And to the extent that you almost become the tree, I mean, not literally physically, but the observer and the observed are the same thing, to use his phrase. Now, I don't know about you, James, because I know you're a writer too. But the very essence of poetry is to do the opposite. That you see a tree, and immediately, or for me anyway, if I want to put it in a poem, I'll be trying to describe its colors, trying to think of its name, thinking of its history, its mythology, looking at its relationship with the rooks and its branches, comparing it with the tree I saw last year, remembering sitting under it with a true love, or with a dog. A whole nexus of associations and thoughts, feelings. And it's the very opposite, I think, to what he's saying, which is, can you see it without any thought, without any impediment? And I think on that basis, that it seems to me that I sort of joke at Brockwood. I say, I'm trying to write as much poetry as possible before I get to enlightenment, which ain't going to happen. But that's my fear, that nothing, that I won't write again, or I won't write in the way that I have been writing, for what it's worth.
But when you're in that state, you wouldn't be fearful of that, though, at all, would you? That would be. See, the fear, I think, is maybe I'm projecting, but the fear, if you're thinking about that future state where you can no longer write because, I don't know, you anything that we do that is outside of function seems to come from a discontent, right? If you weren't discontentful, we wouldn't be here, would we? We wouldn't be talking. And so maybe the fear is the idea of, well, can such a state really be where you're just, and what does that even look like? But I think I am actually I think in time I've sort of sympathized with you more now, that the sort of pressure of poetry, or the pressure of creativity, which is, you'll know as a professional writer, and I know as a writer, in terms of all rationality, is one of the stupidest decisions you can ever make. To quote Cormac McCarthy, you have to be insane to write a novel. It's not a good decision on any, and so that decision can only come from a pressure that is other than function. And so I think creativity broadens what would otherwise be a solipsism, because of what's all this worth if there isn't a sharing? And if the sharing was perfect, it would be horrible, I think. If you just gave something to someone, they said, "Oh yeah, I got that." Well, I'd never trust it, but so isn't that? I think, and I think maybe what Kay is doing is the same thing. I don't want to live in a world where we all just see a tree, I guess, but myself would say that. I don't know. I'm just throwing things at you now, but I think I am with you, because what's the end there if we're all
Well,
sorry, one thing I would say is
yeah.
poetry that is just about a perfect world makes absolutely no sense. I wouldn't want to read those poems. It would be boring. It would be boring, wouldn't it, to read poems that were just everything's fine. Yeah,
I guess so. I'm not sure. I mean, I think going back to what you're saying about discontent, Yeats, the Irish poet, famously said that the argument with other people leads to rhetoric, and the argument with yourself leads to poetry. That, in other words, you need sort of conflict to give you something to write about. That if you are perfectly content, then you don't really have any impetus to write, or write in a way that is traditionally creative. And I suppose because it's been my life, really, for good or for ill, I'm thinking that, well, if I did reach a state of inner harmony and enlightenment, as it were, to use that word, then I really wouldn't write, and I don't know what I'd do. Or I might write in another way, but in what way? I wouldn't write like Shakespeare. Not that I write like Shakespeare anyway, but I mean, Shakespeare seems to be the antithesis of the writer who's reached enlightenment. I mean, the degree of complexity of thought and feeling is extraordinary. I mean, there is a school of poetry called language poetry, which is it's not my cup of tea, really, but it's basically where you just state. I mean, I don't know if you know about it. You just state what's in front of you. So you look out the window and you say, the trampoline is on the grass. There is a rook on the wall. The wall has red bricks in it. It's a sort of a dry litany of statements, which fans of language poetry tend to fall around feeling it's very, very profound. Whereas, as you can tell, I'm skeptical. But I have to say, though, that Krishnamurti, after he'd found enlightenment under the pepper tree in 1922, although it was a gradual and evolving sense of consciousness that he grew into, he did write this extraordinary book called Krishnamurti's Notebook. And it's the only consistent, I think, book I've read that displays someone writing about everyday life or about landscapes from the position of being enlightened. Not a word that he uses, but it's very hard to use a catch-all phrase to describe the consciousness he raised. So to read the Notebook is to get an insight into what someone else might write in terms of style. And I thought I might just read a little extract, James. Would that be interesting?
Absolutely. Yeah.
So this is his notebook. This is the 3rd of August. I'm not sure what year it is. And he says, It was a clear morning, though soon clouds would be gathering. As one looked out of the window, the trees, the fields were very clear. A curious thing is happening. There is a heightening of sensitivity. Sensitivity not only to beauty, but also to all other things. The blade of grass was astonishingly green. That one blade of grass contained the whole spectrum of colour. It was intense, dazzling, and such a small thing, so easy to destroy. Those trees were all of life, their height and their depth. The lines of those sweeping hills and the solitary trees were the expression of all time and space. And the mountains against the pale sky were beyond all the gods of man. It was incredible to see, feel, all this by just looking out of the window. One's eyes were cleansed. So that gives you just a little taste of someone writing from the point of view of a very, very evolved spiritual consciousness or enlightenment. And it's very plain and direct. What did you, out of interest, what would be your reaction?
Well, my immediate thoughts are actually to tie back to bring in one other thing that we haven't mentioned. It's sort of a cornerstone of his teaching to this. So you mentioned language poetry, which I'm only going literally off your description of it now, but there is 2 computer screens in front of me and a beige wall, right, etc., etc. See, now in Kay's teaching, there is the notion of choiceless awareness,
Yes,
against the prior backdrop that the self creates, which is what should be versus what is. Now, the reason I bring that in is that even though language poetry, I guess, would say that it's just describing that isn't what simply is. That's the, literality is not what is. There is more, or they're not even more, but there is a quality that arises. It seems ridiculous to say the sun rises. Well, I guess that's the question, right? Is this what's the difference between the sun rises, that sentence, and the choiceless awareness in description of what it is for the sun to rise to awareness? And my immediate reactions from what you're saying there is, yes, it's very, very plain, but just a tiny addition of this one blade of grass, something else a quality is coming through, which is what is. So I think language poetry, as you've described it, sorry to all language poets, maybe, it's a lie, because that isn't simply what is. But it's the difficulty of to what degree is the conditioning. Let me step back. If you see, say, a magpie on a brick wall and begin to, in purple prose, describe it, maybe the question there is, to what degree is the conditioning of the self sort of suffocating what would be there from choiceless awareness? So I think language poetry is a form of self that seems scared. It seems like it wants to control, doesn't it?
I'll have to row back on. I mean,
I'm sorry.
I mean, I'm not an expert on language poetry. I've just seen enough to realize that it's not my bag, and it seems to be a very artful simplicity, a sort of, well, to my mind, sort of a manufactured naivety. But I mean, there are moments when I think I sort of can see where they're driving at, and it's a sort of a minimalist movement. The idea that too many words spoil the broth, and that by presenting, and they would say to give them their due, that the details they are choosing aren't random.
Mm.
They're carefully selected, although they may seem random. But without getting too much into language poetry, going back to Krishnamurti's, I mean, for me, the Krishnamurti's passage that I read, it has a sort of a slight resemblance of stating, what's in front of you, but in a not literary way, but in a very, very sensitive and accurate, precise and lucid way. In other words, it feels authentic. He's not trying to create an effect beyond this is exactly what he experienced in the words that he could muster. And I'm guessing that's the sort of writing that anyone who reached, if you ask Jesus, please describe the Lake of Galilee for me, I suspect it would be along those lines. He wouldn't be comparing it to a summer's day. Yeah. He wouldn't use the whole literary panoply of metaphor and symbolism and similes and so on. Whereas poets and novelists do. That's one of the great joys, isn't it? There's nothing like a really good simile, whatever. And so I think, so that's, I think, part of my anxiety about Krishnamurti, that when I look at a tree, the last thing I do is sort of look at it in a very direct, selfless way, and I beat myself up in a way that I shouldn't. So yeah, that's that.
Well, I just wonder, what do you think that's something that in a broader scale is to do with security or control? That just description of that kind. I mean, this is what the self always wants to do, is to know in its own ways. To describe is to know, and if we know, well, everything's going to be all right. If we know, except it isn't, of course, right? It's a complete lie. As last time we spoke, you'd just been to the dentist. We both spoke about how the one thing we haven't got past is the dentist. We could describe, and I probably do this in my mind. I say things before going to the dentist, like, think about all the other times that you've had a filling, or you'll be in before you know it. He's a good dentist. Every type of possible description. And yet none of that is dealing with the real thing, which is just, you died. There isn't a security. You've got to do this. There isn't a security.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yes.
But yeah. Well, that was just my hint towards, I guess, wanting security and wanting control. It's difficult to know where to almost like begin to tie things up with Kay's teaching, because there isn't a place that he does it.
No, there isn't really.
What are there maybe suggestions of where you think would be a good place for people to begin with Kay? I mean, I would, that was the first time that I'd read the Notebooks, which actually has a focus on nature, which is very interesting, because it doesn't seem to have a motivation.
Yeah, exactly. Notebook is fascinating, as I think it's a unique book, the Krishnamurti's Notebook. I can't, having written a book, a history of the Christian mystics, I can't think of another work that so consistently portrays the world from the point of view of someone who's reached a very, very high state of consciousness or enlightenment. Nothing like it. In terms of practical help for everyday living, almost any book will do. The one I started on was the first Krishnamurti Reader, edited by Mary Lutchins, which gives extracts from various books, and that's the one I started on. The second Krishnamurti Reader is one that a lot of people favor as well. Commentaries on living. There are three series of these. where he covers almost every life problem you can think of, though he takes it back to the core problem of the self. So I would go for the Penguin Krishnamurti Reader or commentaries on living. I have a huge array really. Got about 20 books, and they're now publishing thematic books, which are extracts from his other books, and put together on a theme like nature or God or death. I'm not sure if I've got one of those here. I probably have. Yes, I've got one in here. And what's it called? It's called, you can't see because it's backward writing.
Oh, there's the one I was about to pick up as well, on fear also. I also have the one on fear.
Yeah, what does that say about us then?
Well.
But I think any of those books will be great, and also the retreat center is a wonderful place too. They have a whole archive there, library, videos, and very, very congenial people who go there. And it's a lovely way to get to know his work, and the more Krishnamurti, the better, really.
And also there is also your novel.
Oh yeah,
there also
thank you.
Your novel, The
Pathless Country.
Pathless Country, by yourself, which includes the protagonist being influenced by Krishnamurti's teachings in the plot.
Yes, he meets the young Krishnamurti who inspires him to go back to Ireland. This is before 1916, and Ireland's becoming more and more militant. And my hero, inspired by Krishnamurti and by letters from Krishnamurti, tries to bring a sense of peace and order to the country. And whether he achieves this or not is in the book. But yeah.
Okay. Well, that seems like a good place, a natural place to finish up. But I will put links for our previous discussion, but also for your for The Pathless Country, your own novel, in the description below, and for your own site. But yeah, James Harpur, it's been a pleasure.
Well, it's been a great pleasure to talk with you, James, and thank you for inviting me.
Thank you.